Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Jeff Kane. I work at the Retreat. I'm a medical doctor. My specialty is addiction medicine, and I've worked in that field, give or take, 40 years. And I'm only one of the resource people in the room, and I'm hoping we'll have a discussion with your questions and comments that will kind of enrich it for everyone. To start off, though, I've just put a few words up on the flip chart that I'd like to ask you about and talk about. I don't think any of us need a recitation of the sort of terrible statistics about addiction, opioid addiction, overdose deaths in Vermont. That's sort of in the paper every day. One of the problems with addiction has to do with what's going on in the brain of those affected, what's going on in society and what people think about one another, and how we all deal with one another. So I'd like to just talk about these three words with you a little bit and ask you to think about them from the inside and the outside. Now, inside and outside doesn't mean, using drugs in the restroom or using drugs in the park. It's what's going on inside the person with addiction and what's going on in the people around that person in the community. Who's got a sense of what does the word stigma mean to any of you? Judgment. Shame. Those people.
Defining people, excuse me, by just one aspect of their being.
Yeah. All right on target. Anyone else? Put in a sort of bigger context. In a culture or in a society, if there are a group of people who have a characteristic that gets labeled, and the other people in the society, culture, community devalue that label, they tend to devalue the person that has those characteristics and not appreciate them as a human being. Have any of you experienced stigma, being the one stigmatized? Hello. Well, I've been there. Yeah. Been there. I'll share a little. I don't expect you guys to share, but you're welcome to. I've been a white guy in the Hill section of New Haven, which is a black and Hispanic neighborhood. I've been a white guy in the South Bronx, and the toughest stint for me was being a white guy on an Indian reservation in Montana for 15 months, where sort of one of the tribe members pointed out that I started with 2 strikes to get me. I was not only white, but I was from the East Coast. And how does it feel when you're stigmatized? When somebody's judging you, they don't really know you, but they're somehow emotionally rejecting you or putting you down. How's that feel? Unwanted. Neglected. I mean, my stint. Less than. My stint in Montana. I've had some rough times since, but that was one of the most painful, difficult periods of my life, to be so set apart by people who really didn't know enough about me to, I think, make a valid judgment. Just white guy, East Coast, write them off. So and we've talked about it more from the outside. I mean, we've said it's painful on the inside, but what do you suppose goes on when somebody has an addictive illness? And self-esteem? They can have and when they're using, if they are trying to stay clean and sober, their self-esteem plummets. So that's part of the problem. Self-loathing. People who are stigmatized may be loathed by the people around them, rejected because they have whatever characteristic it is that puts that label on them. Part of the problem is these people live in that same culture. So they may be judging themselves more harshly than anybody around them is judging them. And language can make a difference. In my personal life and my professional work, I generally no longer use the words addict and alcoholic, because that label in the emotional mind of people who are prone to stigmatize it is a put-down. And if somebody is affected by an addictive illness, if they're kind of still with the greater society and putting it down, it can be a wound. It can hurt. Whereas people who are affected by addictive illness, and often those in recovery, they may use those words with respect, lovingly and respectfully within, say, a 12-step program. So somebody who's in, say, Alcoholics Anonymous and talks about a group of drunks, I mean, that's fellowship, that's comradeship. Although somebody who's maybe just coming in for detox and is disgusted with themselves, with that self-loathing, they may call themselves a drunk with disrespect, and it just deepens their pain. And I don't want to add to anybody's pain. I want to help them to move to a level of acceptance that helps them do what they need to do for recovery.
So what terms do you use, Jeff?
Person addicted to alcohol, or person with addiction, individual with addiction. I might say to somebody, well, you meet the criteria for alcohol use disorder. Severe, which means that list we just went through, you meet like 8 of the 11 criteria, that sort of thing. Trying to keep it matter of fact so that I can not be judgmental and help them to not be judgmental.
And I had spoke with a man who's in recovery who asked that we don't use the word clean because the opposite is dirty, so to use the word abstinent.
Yeah, even when we talk about urine, we try not to use those words, never mind the person themselves. Good. What does addiction like if you're on the outside watching it? Exhausting. Exhausting to watch and exhausting for the person in the midst of it.
The first thing I can think of is fear, and that's because, and you'll know if you're familiar with 498 Marlboro Road, there was a lot of drug dealing going on in this particular building, and everybody in the building got proactive to get these couple of people out, because everybody was scared, because all of a sudden there were apartments being broken into, and hypodermic needles out in the parking lot where kids be running around playing. That was the very first thing.
So fear as a bystander in the community of what those people might do. And it's hard to be compassionate towards someone who might break into your living room.
But then on the other hand, in the same building, there's a young lady who is addicted, and we only see her once in a while when she's coming out to get what she needs. She told me that she's agoraphobic, and all of us who live near her, we look out for her.
Okay.
Because we're terrified, because one night her boyfriend came over and found her purple and called the EMTs, and they woke her up, but they couldn't get her to go to the hospital. You know what I mean? So we care about her.
So this person who lives in the same place that you do, who's gentle and not a threat, you understand and appreciate her as a human being.
Right.
So I don't hear stigma there. It's these other people that you're more afraid of that may put you on edge. Yeah.
I think indescribable sadness from the outside.
Yeah.
And indescribable sadness to watch. I mean, people in Al-Anon, Nar-anon will sometimes encourage one another to back off, to detach with love, because it can be so sad and heartbreaking to be right up close when somebody's life is going down the tubes. How does addiction happen? What's going on in these individuals? You see it from the outside, and it's scary because you fear for them. It's scary because you may feel for yourself. It can be exhausting and heartbreaking. But what's going on? What's the process? What do these drugs do, Prudence?
Well, I'm just thinking that people are in emotional pain. So there's some, trying to self-medicate.
So they're escaping their emotional self to some extent with the mood change that comes with these chemicals. Yeah.
Despair, a lot of despair.
Okay.
It just start off experimentation.
So they think it's cool, and then things happen.
And their brain is changing.
How is their brain changing, Cindy?
They're becoming, their brain is telling them that they need the drug, that they crave the drug.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all that matters. Nothing else matters.
You make me think, one young man said, I used like my life depended on it. It's that kind of a basic instinctual drive. Now, show of hands, how many people have heard of dopamine? What's dopamine?
That's the stuff that fires up your neurotransmitter.
Okay. Somebody want to add to that? It's
Pleasure response.
a pleasure response. It's the neurotransmitter that mediates or causes pleasure in the pleasure center of the nucleus accumbens. And all addictive substances, by one route or another, boost the effects of dopamine. So addictive substances cause mood change. It feels good. Some people, especially if they're just experimenting, they like the reward. It's like 5 times better than food or sex. So why not go back and do it again? It also, the mood change, takes them away from emotional pain. We know people are predisposed to addiction by their genetics. Lots of people have a family history, but also by painful experiences in childhood. And either way, whether people are using it to get high or using it to escape pain or get relief, it conditions the primitive instinctual part of the brain, the brainstem and the limbic system. Anybody think of breathing in the last couple of minutes? In the lower part of our brainstem, there's a center that drives breathing. And that's the instinctual part of the brain. And that's where the changes take place, where the conditioning takes place. Jed, what's your favorite sport to play?
To play?
To play.
Basketball.
Basketball. This doesn't say much about Jed. I'm sure you're a better basketball player than I am. And you would probably, if you were holding a basketball, you'd have moves that would fake me out and get you to the basket.
I hope so.
And you wouldn't have to think about it much.
No.
And this primitive part of the brain is where we have muscle memory and emotional memory. Reward, the psychologists call positive reinforcement. Relief from displeasure, they call negative reinforcement. And either one conditions the brain. I'm going to tell you a story about a dog. The family dog, name was Chino, big golden retriever, was friendly to everybody, not much of a watchdog. Family member decided he should be a better watchdog. And this person trained Chino to bark and go to the door when someone came to the house. He wasn't good about spotting someone coming to the house, so the person trained him to have a cue, a signal. That person would say, Chino, who's here? And he would bark and go to the door. Well, one night, it was like 2 o'clock in the morning. I was getting ready to give a talk the next day, and I was sitting at the kitchen table. Everybody's asleep, including Chino, but he's right by my feet. And I hadn't been with this group before, and I was going to introduce myself, but then see who was in the room. So I was whispering my rehearsal, just barely whispering. I'll say it out loud here, but so rehearsing. Before we begin this morning, I'd like to get some idea of who's here. Woof! Woof! The sleeping dog barked out loud because the signal came. Who's here? He didn't get up and go to the door, but that was totally instinctual. The signal happened and he reacted. Now, people with addiction, once it's developed, once it's programmed into this primitive part of the brain by pleasure and escape from displeasure, from relief, it's automatic behavior. So that if they're exposed to the cue, just like the dog that heard who's here, they react. Now, and people will talk about how automatic it is and how overpowering it is. A woman 25 years old, addicted to alcohol, she said, I wish my car would stop turning in at the liquor store. Now, and that's addiction. Or people, they determine not to use that day, and people will act without making a decision to act, or they'll make a decision that they're not going to do something and then they'll do it anyway. Because this primitive part of the brain, it's like the horse that a rider's on top of. What determines where a horse and rider go together? Anyone? Rider on horseback?
Ultimately the horse.
Well, ultimately the horse, that's where the power is. And a lot depends on the skill of the rider and the relationship the rider has with the horse. Last time I got on a horse, it was a long time ago, and the horse took me for a ride because I didn't know what I was doing. And I didn't want to fall off, so I squeezed the horse with my knees, and when I say that, riders smile and say that's a signal to the horse to go faster. So I was making it worse by what came naturally to me. And I meet people with addiction who, they're like somebody from away whose car is stuck in the snow and they keep hitting the gas to spin. It's not like you can get yourself out of it by an act of will and determination. It's because it's in this primitive instinctual part of the brain. That's where the changes happen. People can get well when they understand what they're up against and stay out of harm's way. Chief, highest form of self-defense?
Excuse me?
The highest form of self-defense?
Not engaging.
Yeah. No contact. Get out of the way. You might have to do more if you're wearing a uniform, but right on. You know, butt heads. So when people learn that they can, if they simply avoid, I talked with a young woman in the hospital this morning, like 25 years old, but she hadn't had alcohol for 4 months. She said, I can't go to bars. Bingo. You know, I can't hang out with people who are using anymore. Bingo. That's the kind of responsibility people need to take for themselves to get better. And this automatic response to cues, or if they take a sip, it may be a gallon. But it's more complicated than that, because where do we make up our minds? What part of the brain? Anyone? Yeah, right there. The prefrontal cortex. Lots of different names for every part of the brain, but the executive brain. What's going on in the executive brain with addiction is what the psychologists call an altered motivational hierarchy. What's important is less important. Remember, because the unconscious brain knows that the dopamine kick from more drug is going to be 5 times more powerful than food or sex. So in deciding, my plan for the day, it's like more drug is going to seem more appealing to me. It's going to make more sense in my distorted thinking than taking care of my kids or even showing up for work. So people, or even staying out of this lady's living room. People will steal from family members. They'll steal from others. They'll maybe crash on the highway under the influence of something, not because they don't care, but because about the damage, but because they care more in that moment about getting more drug, getting more dopamine from whatever the substance is. And it's not a reasoned decision, it's an automatic one. It's an overpowering one. It's like the horse that took me for a ride. Sir, you were going to say something before?
I'm just trying to figure out how you would describe chemical dependency when I think of addiction. And it sounds like it's learned behavior. I always thought there was a chemical thing that was going on.
I think the term chemical dependency is fairly old. I mean, like 70s, maybe 80s. And chemical refers to the chemical substances, alcohol, heroin, cocaine, what have you. The chemical substances interact with brain chemistry, mainly receptor sites in one form or another, either imitating chemicals that are there already or boosting them somehow or inhibiting them somehow. And we know a fair amount about that. The process of addiction, though, I would describe it kind of as I'm doing, where there's this overpowering response to cues and impaired judgment that sets people up for more. And emotion is involved in keeping the cycle going, because if I'm You know, if I get on the horse again and squeeze even harder with my knees, you know, that's not going to save me. And that's the kind of despair and disappointment and self-loathing when people don't understand what they're up against and they keep doing the same thing and keep failing. You know, it's disheartening.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I have an issue with food.
Okay.
It's still an addiction that I have to deal with every day.
Yeah, and the chemical dependencies usually these, you know, kind of nameable addictions. People talk maybe metaphorically, but maybe in the brain it's a similar process with food and exercise and shopping and gambling and what have you. Gambling is probably the most research on it. Cindy?
Well, it's my understanding too with an opiate addiction, if they're using because they feel so bad physically, that they're using just to feel normal, so that they don't get sick.
And absolutely. Once people have sort of sought to get high a bunch of times or sought to get relief a bunch of times, the brain, which we talk about the brain's ability to change that lasts as long as we live, it's neuroplastic. It adjusts to things. It's always trying to keep things in balance. And if there's this, talk about heroin, this pain-relieving, sedating, pleasure-causing chemical there all the time, the brain cells are learning to push back against that. And if suddenly there's not enough there, the pushback sort of overshoots. So people won't be able to sleep. They'll have pain. They'll feel cranky and unpleasant. You know, heroin and opioids are constipating. They may get diarrhea. I mean, it's sort of the opposite to the effects. So people literally get sick. People will say dope sick from withdrawal. And some of the medicines we use to treat opioid dependence, methadone and buprenorphine, act similarly, but when people are at a stable dose, it's not mood changing. They don't get sort of pleasure and reward, but they don't have withdrawal, and they don't have the same craving or drive to use. So, coming back to stigma, I want to emphasize the point that people who have addiction, it's the nature of addiction that they can't keep promises to themselves, and they may often do things that go against their own values, your values too, acting on addiction. And that brings me to the third word on this list, respect. There are a couple words I want to talk about, but just when I say respect, is there anything that comes to your minds that might have to do with the plight of someone with addiction who's also in the community or in society? Go.
Well, with the young lady in my building, some of my friends at first thought I was just crazy, but I just decided to show her love. And I pray for her on a regular. And I just care for her so much. I just see something in her, and I just have so much hope for her, you know what I'm saying? And she doesn't cause any trouble in the building or anything.
What a lovely gift. What a lovely gift. Cassandra?
I always find it interesting that when somebody's in recovery, you know, you see something like a talk show and somebody's recovering and they get through a major applause, you know, that they get the respect, but when they're actually struggling with the addiction, they don't. And it's very dependent sometimes for people in recovery, with addiction, of where they're at with that and how people are treating them. So that's why I think when I look at respect, I think it can go extreme both ways.
And that can spell trouble when somebody's not in recovery. How many people have heard? Well, they relapse. How many people have heard of motivational interviewing? A bunch. It's sort of an approach to therapy or to interviewing where the interviewer maintains empathy, understanding, unconditional acceptance of the person that they're interviewing. And by making connections with that person, gets into the person's own feelings about stuff. It's incredibly respectful and incredibly helpful because it's accepting people as they are and kind of exploring what's important to them. Motivational interviewing draws a lot on the work of the psychologist Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers was famous for coining the phrase unconditional positive regard, which is embedded in motivational interviewing. Carl Rogers is also famous for saying something like, people are unable to change until they accept themselves the way they are. So for someone to get into recovery from addiction, it's important for them to kind of get what's going on. And you know, the young woman who couldn't not turn into the package store if she drove by it, she didn't need to scold herself for that. She needed to adjust her routes, or maybe not even get behind the wheel without a buddy system, a family member or a sponsor from AA or something to help sort of chaperone her to stay out of trouble. It's not a character failing. It's the result of this change in the brain from conditioning. The two words I think of with respect are responsibility and accountability. Now, people aren't going to get better from addiction unless they sort of get out of the way, unless they take responsibility for who they're with and what they're doing. They also tend not to get better from addiction unless they share their feelings and share their story with someone who'll respect them and understand them the way they are, so they can get better at understanding themselves the way they are. So there's a tremendous interpersonal process, because positive relationships change the brain and change behavior for the better. Addictive drugs change the brain and change behavior for the worse. But with respect, people in recovery take more and more responsibility for what they're doing and who they're with. And like the woman who's not going to bars and not hanging out with the people she used to hang out with. The rest of us, people in the community who may not be affected by active addiction right now, it's helpful to understand people and where they're at, but also to hold them accountable. Who's familiar with the term enabling? What's enabling?
Taking responsibility for.
Enabling. Taking responsibility for the person with the addiction, so that you make it easy for them to stay addicted. Making excuses. Whereas if we, and sometimes that's trying a desperate need to make ourselves feel okay, as opposed to help them with whatever's going on. When we hold people accountable for their behavior, under the law or in families, in relationships, then people are more likely to be more responsible in their own lives and be more likely to do what is going to help them to stay away from substances. I was careful not to say clean and sober.
I just want to make sure we have time for people to ask questions.
And I wanted to go there right now. So as I said before, there are a lot of sort of people with expertise in addiction and recovery and community programs and clinical programs in the room. But if, I don't know if people have looked in the secret ballot box for questions, or if anybody just wants to raise questions here.
We'll start with people in the space.
I just want to say one thing about the term enabling, which is that I find that it's a bit pejorative, in that enabling becomes a term that blames the person who's trying to take care of the person with the problem for perpetuating the problem. Really, they're just desperately trying to help. And the term enabling is kind of...
Thank you.
Term,
right on.
Addiction.
What would you suggest?
I'm not sure,
Well, I kind of agree with what you're saying, Daria, and I was thinking about respect for the person, but respect for the illness, the powerfulness of the illness,
Mm-hmm.
so that respect also needs to be extended to family members who are dealing with something that is a monster in their midst.
Yeah.
And I think that takes time, just like for the individual who has the addiction, it takes time to really understand for themselves. I think for the family members, it's about learning to respect the power of the disease, so that no matter what you do, you can't love them out of it.
Well put. I think as a community, we want to have respect and understanding for everybody. And you two made a good case for the people who aren't the people with addiction. Yeah.
If I could just add to that, I think one of the things that Susan's talking about is the idea of externalizing the problem, which is to make the problem, not the person the problem. And so that the addict gets pushed around by the drug, and so does everybody he or she lives with, and beyond. Kind of, it's it's kind of like it's the problem that's causing this.
There are a whole bunch of handouts from community programs and things on this table over toward the door. One of them, the title is "Curbing Addiction is Everybody's Business," and you two say that very, very well. Thank you.
One of the things that I think about is detachment. Detachment is a word, but it is a very powerful. It's a very powerful word that takes a lifetime to understand. If you have a loved one who is in the throes of an addiction, you try to do everything you think you should be doing as a parent, as a spouse, and the harder you try, the harder you fail. And so for me, understanding detachment is just learning a way of life when you have addiction in your family.
I just got detached from a message on my pager. No problem.
I have a sibling who's been struggling for decades, and we lost our mother just a year ago, and the last few years that I was caring for her, he very rarely came around, and in fact, he missed her actual leaving because he was so addicted, and I got to the point where I just can't communicate with him at all, and he finally got it in his head that if he wants to talk to me, he better call me before he pops any pills or drinks anything, because I cannot talk to him. I will not talk to him. He's like that. And I used to worry about him, but it got to the point where I realized I just have to turn it over to the Lord, because the Lord is bigger than me. There's nothing I can do but pray for my brother.
Good example of detachment in that situation and maintaining the positive regard. And a lot of people who understand addiction think of it in terms of spirituality, and there may be as many different understandings of spirituality as there are humans, yet prayer sounds like a very personally relevant activity for you, and you do that, which is tremendously respectful and hopeful is another one of your words for that person. Nice. Questions from the question box?
Is an addiction always a lifelong issue?
Anyone want to answer that? Yes. And why? My answer would be can be. I've been working in like the ICU, the intensive care unit of addiction treatment, for decades, and the people I meet are pretty stuck unless they kind of keep their distance and ask for help for the rest of their lives, and maybe be on medication and some kind of maintenance therapy, 12-step or otherwise. in the greater community, the people who may show up in surveys once in a while or self-report once in a while, but don't pass through formal addiction treatment, there are a lot of people who get a pretty significant routine with drugs going, alcohol or other drugs, and then move out of it. So, and without formal help, or maybe with less than professional help, but some kind of help. So that for me, as I focus on that question, there's a lot of gray, and there may be some people who return to. They may have qualified as alcoholic, but they return to some alcohol. I personally never promote controlled drinking or whatever with patients that I'm working with, but I wouldn't say it doesn't exist. You know, so Jed, you're nodding your head. Do you kind of agree with the worldview or whatever that I'm talking about?
I agree. I think it's more of it may be more of a personal. For me, it's definitely a lifelong, not battle, but it's going to be lifelong. I'm going to be working on these things probably for the rest of my life. Whereas I've heard people say that they've recovered from their addiction and it is no longer a problem. So I think all that gray area you were talking about doesn't exist.
No. Susan.
Why I say yes to this is because this not only involves the addict, this involves the addict, the family, and the community, and what I call the ripple effect of addiction goes through your family, and lives are changed forever. They don't always recover from that.
When I'm talking with patients who are not as clearly overwhelmed by addiction as some other patients, and we talk about whether they should return to use. Usually alcohol is the conversation, is a topic of conversation. I'll encourage them to very, very carefully consider whether they want to bet their well-being on what may be a long shot. Yeah.
I've heard this description, and you may know more about it than me, but on a biochemical and brain level, the story goes that a person can use nicotine, for example. They could quit cigarettes, say, for 10, 15 years. But what happens when you get addicted to any substance is that the pleasure sensors get rewired. And that pathway is there. There's a highway to the pleasure sensor. And even though you're not using that highway, 10 or 15 years later, somebody goes to a wedding or whatever, and they say, somebody's having a cigarette, maybe I can have a puff or two, and they have a few puffs on a cigarette, and then 10 days, 2 weeks, a month later, you know, when he inhales that nicotine, the pleasure sensor says, oh, the highway says, oh, I remember you, give me more. You know, and 2 weeks or a month later, they're smoking a pack a day again. So, you know, is that lifelong? I don't know.
Yeah, and I'll sometimes ask patients, can you unlearn how to ride a bike? And anybody here go to the domino extravaganzas at the art museum? I didn't go this year, I went last year. You know, 35,000 dominoes, they topple one, the rest fall down. In the brain, there's a circuit where usually a glutamate is the chemical messenger that from like one bit of the substance will cause other things to happen, leading to the addictive behavior, just as sort of you described it in that case example. So and addiction follows kind of laws of nature. You know, we understand them through neuroscience and chemistry, but gravity and physics line up a row of dominoes. Would you topple the first one against all the others and expect that they wouldn't fall down? You know, it's sort of the laws of nature take over. And it's the same way in the brain if people, you know, if some people take any of the substance that they've been addicted to, they get it going again. Yes?
As we're talking about this,
if you get hit by a train, is it the engine that kills you or the caboose, right? So, right, it would make sense that always to avoid the engine, right? But on the other side, I'm thinking of healing in recovery. And once healing begins, it opens the door for more healing. And healing can happen, and healing can be a lifelong experience. And so is addiction in healing, or healing from addiction can be a lifelong experience? I would say yes.
And much better than addiction. I think people who get into recovery often have patterns of honesty and responsibility and sharing and connection with people that makes them much better off than they would have been if they never took the detour into the trouble that they were in.
So I guess my question is, my father was an alcoholic, and at one point he had quit drinking, and I knew he drank a lot at certain points, and you obviously knew when he was drunk, but I realized after he really sobered up that he was probably always drunk to some level, because he changed really like a lot, his personality. And he ended up being a very shy man, which I didn't know. And so I had him at a gathering, he like pretty much hung outside the whole time. And I guess it's like that piece too, somebody's a long-term, has a long-term addiction, and it's a consistent one. And then their personality changes in some way when they've sobered up, because that drug has helped them maybe to be more social or to feel less pain or something. And sometimes I think we also need to support them in that way, because sometimes you want to encourage that happy, fun person. Like, where's that person? I miss them. And I guess I just wanted to just put that out there as how, maybe, I don't know what to say to that, but I think that that's something that we need to be aware of too, that, yeah.
Learning to live a fulfilling life, absent the substance that may have been a social lubricant, can be a challenge.
Yeah.
And a lot of treatment centers.
And how are we encouraging? Like, I just don't. We have to be aware that we're not like kind of encouraging the behavior that they had or the personalities they had when they were under the influence.
And sometimes families will sabotage recovery because they want some aspect of the person's using behavior back. Maybe not so much the charming and social side, but somebody who's too stoned to balance the checkbook, and the spouse takes over the checkbook, and then they sort of get off whatever it was they were using, and they want to take the budget back, and the person who's been taking care of it may have been longing for that person to get better, but now it's crowding their sort of the power distribution in the household, and they may not consciously but unwittingly somehow sabotage it to kind of get their power back. It gets pretty complicated.
Or maybe like a codependent relationship where now they don't need to be taken care of, so there's that maybe struggle of like, let me take care of you, maybe.
Yeah.
That might also be happening.
I miss taking care of you, so we get sick again, that kind of thing.
Well, my sweetie's been clean and sober for 3 years, and all of a sudden he's been giving me money and taking me out to dinner and stuff. I'm not busting.
Yeah, you're not going to rock that boat.
I think it can be a little different. From my perspective, I've been free of using heroin for many, many, many years. I have no fear of relapse at all. But just stopping, getting to the point where you're not taking the drug anymore, doesn't mean that you've gotten over the issues, the problems that caused the addiction in the first place. So you may have the resolve and the wherewithal to keep from taking drugs, and you may have no reason or fear of relapse, but you may work on those issues for the rest of your life.
Can I infer that you advocate working on those issues?
I think one has to. I mean, just because that's at the root of all of it.
Would anyone who doesn't have issues please stand up? Going back to sort of talking about responsibility, there's, for every one of us humans, there's more to who we are and more to why we do the things we do than what meets our own mind. And we'll never get rid of some of those motivational blind spots, the emotional motivational blind spots, yet we can reduce them by getting more in touch with our feelings, exploring our personal and emotional history more, working with a therapist, being direct and honest with people who are in our families and otherwise in our lives. And as we do that, and there's a whole science of interpersonal neurobiology. I talked about neuroplasticity before. The brain will adapt and compensate for drugs being around, and then you get sick if you stop using them. But the brain adapts in other ways. When we connect openly and honestly and emotionally with another person, we're both benefiting from that. We're both getting nourished from that. Somebody took the work of, I mentioned Carl Rogers before, another psychologist around that time, a guy named Sidney Girard. People quote him as at least having the stuff that led to the statement that if we talk about where self-worth comes from in a human being, we can fill ourselves up 15% of the way, but never more than 15% through achievement. And kind of our culture and sometimes our families, they're pushing achievement. Whereas, you run out of room for more self-worth from achievement. The 85% is said to come from healthy relationships. And that's not where the young guy helps me across the street. But if the young man were around when that dog I named died, and I was grieving and crying and sobbing, if the young man were around to witness that and let me know he gets it, how moved I am, then we both get some payoff in this emotional department, in the self-worth department. If, I won't take a poll, but if right now you have trouble asking for help, if you have trouble crying when you have a witness, if you have trouble owning your own, and shame is part of how we're wired, our own feelings of less than and insecurity. If you're having trouble talking about that, then think about therapy. Think about a 12-step program, whether it's Al-Anon or Nar-anon or ACOA, if you can find a meeting these days, or AA or NA.
What is ACOA?
Adult Children of Alcoholics. It's a branch of Al-Anon, which is also related to Nar-anon. Or Nar.
So recently, in the news, addiction is now formally a disease. Is that right?
Yes, it has been for a long time. And it remains controversial. And I haven't written about that since last week. Posted a blog yesterday saying there's no such thing as a disease. We sometimes think of diseases as like a monster that'll come and get us. But really, it's just a category. It's a concept. And every human's different. Everyone's version of a particular illness is different, but when people have enough characteristics in common, we use a term or a label, a disease name, that helps us understand the causes based on studies in other people and possible treatments based on how other people who fit that pattern have responded. So it's a very useful category. And sort of alcohol addiction or alcohol dependence, alcohol use disorder, all the other substance use disorders are in the taxonomies, the classifications of diseases. So they're there. And I personally believe they have value for understanding what's going on in the cellular and chemical parts of the body, and especially these days in treating it. There are people who are invested in thinking, well, it's really a learning disorder, and something we talked about earlier kind of set that line of thinking up, or it's an attachment disorder. And I don't think we need to have knockdown, drag-out fights about what to call it. We need to kind of respect the people who have this and help them to get better. So the terminology that we use is always kind of arbitrary. Professional wrestling. Would you call that a sport or improvisational theater? I think you can call it either one. It's still what it is. And I think the terminology isn't so important as the people who have the pain and suffering, the dis-ease that we're talking about, and respecting them and helping them is what we're gathering to do. So if calling something a disease helps somebody feel less stigmatized, I'm all for it.
How does somebody check themselves yet be supportive of somebody dealing with addiction? So, you talk about that, people stealing from family members and like, this woman here speaking about how she used not to speak to her brother unless he was so, not under the influence of the substance that he was addicted to. So I feel like, how can one make sure that that person's not feeling alone in their struggle, and that they're getting supported while still protecting oneself? And I think this is just something that we'll talk about the community safety next time, but I feel like personal safety when you're working, with somebody in your life dealing with addiction.
People have some ideas about that?
Well, I have a good therapist.
You have a good therapist.
Yeah, I have a good therapist. So that works for me. And I have a lot of faith.
I think with Al-Anon, Nar-anon Detached with Love, we talked about accountability and responsibility, and I think it's important to set clear expectations and have clear consequences, and that can be done with, I hope it can be done with compassion and firmness at the same time. And tough love, and the plight of parents with an addicted kid can be very difficult, because if they're too easy and forgiving and take away the consequences, that can prolong the problem and it may not end well. If they come on strong all at once and give an ultimatum that may be unrealistic to be met, and it's not met, and then they have to deliver the consequence, that could lead to disaster then and there. So I encourage people to understand that maybe they want to find some middle ground where they set some realistic expectations, monitor whether they're met or not, and deliver the consequences, but have kind of a string of consequences so that they don't have to get into sort of all or none responses right away. Prudence, you're thinking. I can see it.
Well, I was just thinking of something that I guess it was a video or a YouTube presentation about the opposite of addiction is not recovery, the opposite of addiction is connection. And maybe that's too general, and maybe that's not useful, but I do think about that it's partly perhaps some social isolation that helps, encourages people to walk down that road of addiction.
Love it. I think there are some people writing about addiction these days who refer to like rat experience. They'd get rats hooked on something, and I think cocaine, and they'd be alone and they'd like die using cocaine. They'd put them with other rats and they'd become indifferent to the cocaine. So that Since 1974, I've been quoting the line, "The treatment of addiction is people." And the word connection, people sometimes equate with spirituality or positive spirituality. And sort of recovery is a word people use, and a lot of us have some very positive associations with that word. You use the word connection, though, it's more concrete about what it's all about.
There's a contradiction to that. Excuse me. However, when you are in a position where you have a family member who is just walking their own walk, you have to stop and take care of yourself. You know, the connection, you would like the connection to be there, but on the other hand, you have this, my therapist said, you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself first.
Sure, if they're in active addiction and they're not responding to your presence, sure.
Have they shown in different societies where maybe there is a more communal feel and there's more support from the broader community, which is kind of that connection piece? Because I do feel like, you know, over time we've isolated ourselves as in our American culture, and I'm wondering if that has shown to actually make a difference in people's either not becoming addicted or in the recovery. I don't know. Just that's another question with that connection piece. I'm just wondering, like, if that's already present in a society, then is that actually making a difference with addiction?
I don't have like research or data to quote. I have some personal observations, though. I think for addiction to get going, there need to be vulnerable people. To some extent, everybody's vulnerable, but some are genetically more vulnerable. Adverse childhood experiences make them more vulnerable. There needs to be a substance available, and then the person or people have to use it, which means there's some kind of permissive attitudes or permissive thinking around use. And my immediate reflection is when I was working on the Indian reservation. There's genetic predisposition, there was a lot of abuse and poverty, so there was the emotional predisposition, so a lot of vulnerable people. The reservation was dry, but it wasn't hard to get alcohol. It was right on an interstate highway where this was before the reformulation of OxyContin, so there was plenty of opioids around. And there was permissive attitudes towards using it. It was kind of expected to get high or intoxicated on one thing or another. And we talk about a fellowship of people in recovery. There can be a fellowship of people using stuff too, which is extremely dangerous and harmful. When people in that society would start to maybe hit some kind of a bottom and decide to do things differently, well, I'll put it another way. In that culture, it was hard to hit a bottom, because even if the family of origin said, we've had enough, we're not going to help anymore, the tribe had, I want to say 5 or 6 or 7 different kind of extended families or clans that would be supportive, and somebody might, because of addiction, no longer be able to stay under the roof of the family that they grew up in, but there would, as someone put it, there's always an auntie somewhere, somebody else in this culture who would take people in, and that kind of nurturing, accepting culture might be great if you were slow mentally or disabled in some way or not capable of kind of independent living because of a handicap. But with addiction, it made it hard to kind of hit the sort of bottom that can give the pain and arousal that leads someone to change. So I think connection and mutual respect throughout society is very important, yet it has to come with kind of all of us holding all of the rest of us accountable for certain stuff.
I just want to say that the gift of desperation, as they say in the 12-step programs, but an observation that I see in this community is people not aware of what addiction can do, helping people with the addiction out, and that person addicted not being able to hit their bottom and just, I mean, there's the word again, enabling almost, but unwillingly assisting or whatever you want to call it, you know, and it just prolongs that.
I meet, well,
I'd like to contradict myself from what I said earlier, which is, I think there is such a thing as cultural enabling. You know, we live in a society where you can fix things like that, whether it's by the internet or getting a magic pill, or you got a headache. You don't think of what else you can do for a headache. You take something, you know, and that's just been going on for decades or longer. So.
there are magic pills.
I had a question that's in the box, which is, what has changed in 40 years? You know, what are we missing? That's my question.
What has changed in 40 years? In the 50s, I mean, people started to kind of think of addiction, more alcohol than other addictions then, as a disease. And in the 30s, people started making connections with one another and found when they stopped squeezing the horse with their knees or hitting the accelerator in the snow, and owned their limitations honestly with other people, they could stay off the addictive substance. And that's still true. We still have people who need to learn that, but that's still true. What has changed is, and I've worked in treatment for a whole bunch of years. What has changed in treatment is how professionals interact with patients who have addiction. And I wish this was true everywhere. It's still not, because there are some people that I at least read about who seem to be still pursuing treatment like people did in the 80s, thinking they were doing the right thing. I mentioned motivational interviewing. A couple of months ago at an addiction medicine conference, Bill Miller, the psychologist from New Mexico who helped create this, did a demonstration, and he showed a video that was produced, I think it may have been the 90s or the 80s, and it was how to engage someone in treatment. And it was a clinician working with a woman with addiction, and the clinician was sort of listing everything was wrong and saying what needed to be done about it and kind of giving assignments, and now will you do this or will you do that? It was very kind of top down, they'd call it, management. And this was how it was supposed to be done. But Miller's pointing out that when any of us do that with someone, we're taking all the good lines. And when the person themselves says what's wrong or says what should change, then they own it, they're more likely to do it and follow through. He then showed a video of Teresa Moyers, Dr. Moyers, a psychologist who does motivational interviewing all the time, and she had an interview. It was set up for her to have this actor come in, and he was going to role play something with addiction, and she was going to question him, and they were going to demonstrate it. But before they started filming, he went out for like 4 cigarette breaks. So Terry said, you know, let's not do what we planned, and she got the guy's permission to interview him about his smoking, and he readily agreed. So, and I only saw like 6 minutes of the interview. He did most of the talking. She, I don't think, said anything that wasn't a clarification or empathic comment to something he already said. And he was talking himself into quitting in 6 minutes. or at least thinking how he might want to move toward that. So instead of the hot seat approach, we got to break through denial, we got to get you to admit you this or that label, which research has shown to be toxic. It's a much more gentle and respectful approach to the patient now. Again, not everywhere, but much better. They called the 90s the decade of the brain because of all the amount of brain research and understanding that went on then. And that hasn't stopped. There's this huge increase in understanding, what I described in a kind of descriptive way about how addiction works and what happens to that motivational hierarchy. That's all the last 10 or 15 years of research. And with that has come medications that can help people who need better traction as they're taking the hike of recovery. Addiction doesn't, it's not magic, addiction doesn't get people better, but it can give a lot of people better traction as they go. Cassandra?
We have time for one quick question, and then we get a
Okay. Should that come from the group or come from the box?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is pot addictive? Everyone can hear me. Is pot addictive?
Is pot addictive in the way that I described it? A chemical substance that causes release of dopamine and can condition the brain to get it and to get it sort of automatically. From a physiologic and a pharmacologic standpoint, yes.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? We just have to be out of the library in 10 minutes, so I just want to make sure we have time for, we have one more. Thank you.
I don't know if this is a reasonable observation or not, but say, what's changed in the last 40 years, for me, 45 years. There's a big political change. Back when I was actively using, it was, in spite of who I am, addiction was, especially opiate addiction, was largely considered a problem of the inner city and black and brown people, and it was an issue of personal responsibility. It was an issue of just people with lousy responsibility, lousy personal responsibility. That's what everybody thought at that time, and I think as we see a lot of people with more means and whiter skin starting to fall into the trap of addiction, we cock our heads and start looking at it a little differently. And I think that it's a good thing. I mean, it's a good thing for everybody, but for a lot of people that I remember, it's too little, too late.
Because they did now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Stigma compounding stigma. Inner cities, poverty, racism, addiction. Talk about a stacked deck.
Right. I mean, think of all the stigma there is now, even though we start looking at it as a disease and not a problem so much of personal responsibility, and it's a sea change, and it's great. It's really, really good.
Yeah.
But those poor people,
and
they had to go through that.
Yeah, it's really sad.
I kind of want to go back to my question, because my question has to do with what's the percentage of the population in terms of addiction today as opposed to 40 years ago? Anybody know?
Anybody have a comment on epidemiologically we'd call that a prevalence question, and I don't know about comparative statistics. I think we probably have better estimates now than we did long ago, but there's people say 20 million, 22 million people in the United States with untreated addiction.
So is that an increase?
I don't have that. I don't have the reference point. I don't have the reference point. I think where we do have a reference point is in opioid dependence. It's been skyrocketing since the mid-1990s. Skyrocketing. Alcohol may be harder to know. I just sort of wrap up with sort of tying this gentleman's comments in with what we've been talking about. People in the 1930s started talking about being powerless over alcohol and then other substances. The neurobiology of addiction is that this instinctual part of the brain gets changed in understandable ways, conditioning, so that self-defeating behavior gets empowered. And that's a natural occurrence. Nobody needs to feel less than if they happen to acquire that condition. And people don't sign up for it. It happens. So to judge them as irresponsible is stigmatizing and disrespectful. However, for people affected by that condition, it's important to take responsibility for coping with it by staying out of harm's way, by keeping the distance from the substances, and by getting more honest and open in relationships, by asking for help. And then they can recover, maybe with specialized treatment and medications. And to the extent the whole community is with them in that campaign, so much the better. All right. Thank you all so much.
I just gave everybody these random. That's for the happy face, neutral face, sad face. So let everybody know how you felt about today. And if you have anything you want to have for future topics, there's some sticky notes over with some pencils. So please help us in our future conversations. And again, feel free to add any comments to the faces there.
And there's an abundance of handouts on the table, and we'll have to take them home if you don't, so help yourselves, please.
Ms. Cameron, what's your blog?
It's on ncadd.org, the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence. And Jeff Kane.
Do you want to write it? I'm going to put it on the piece. Do you have something like that?
Just that question about when that data is available and we can get that information and maybe ready for the next session. Other cultures. Do we have an interest in our culture? Not just in the security of our drug dealing, but in terms
Like comparing the U.S. to other countries.
I can share.
Oh, that would be great.
And there, if you haven't given us your contact information, you can put that on a sticky note and give it to Brian in the back, if you don't mind Brian being the collector of contact information, and we'll make sure to continue to invite you to future conversations. We will be, again, having them on VCTV, so if you wanted to make sure other people have access to this, keep an eye on VCTV. I just want to thank the guys for filming this, and please spread the word. I think this is such an education even for us in the field. So thank you, Jeff, for your time.
And if you haven't had enough, the blogs are on a website, geoffkane.com, GEOFFKANE.
You heard that there's water some would die to find in a well in some forest can turn more than to wine. No, not sure I believe it. I'm not sure that I